Disconnection. Welcome back to Weekly Wisdom. I'm Pastor Cheryl. Thank you for joining me for the fourth installment of our Unmasking series, as we explore Genesis 3. This week's passage will focus on verses 20 through 24. Let's read them. The man named his wife Eve because she is the mother of everyone who lives. The Lord made the man and his wife leather clothes and dressed them. The Lord God said, "The human being has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Now, so he doesn't stretch out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever, the Lord God sent him out of the Garden of Eden to farm the fertile land from which he was taken. He drove out the human to the east of the Garden of Eden. He stationed winged creatures wielding flaming swords to guard the way to the tree of life." Whoa. This passage, it really speaks of disconnection. We've traveled on this journey of Eve and Adam making the decision to believe the lie of the enemy over the truth of God, and how that has led to this rift in a relationship that was so harmonious that there weren't any names, any proper names. You know, in this part of the Bible, in Genesis, they don't have to even say God or Lord or Holy One, Sovereign One. They don't have to address God by name. They're in such close relationship and such community that if they want to speak to God, they just speak because God's right there. And they recognize God's presence in the same way. If you're around a table full of people engaging in conversation and you know everyone and you're familiar with everyone, that you can speak and you don't even need to name the person that you're addressing your comments to specifically, because they just know right out of the basis of the relationship that you have. And that's the type of intimate and connected relationship that God intended and that we see demonstrated in the beginning, in the very beginning, as it's laid out with Adam and Eve and telling the story. But Eve doesn't even get a name until this chapter, until these verses. Adam, we think of him getting a proper name in the beginning, but Adam is a Hebrew word for human being. So it was like the first humans, and now they're identified by name. God will eventually be identified through names. And there's something about names, though, because they're identifiers. They are the way to mark who someone is and to track the course of someone's life. When we know someone's name, we know something about them. We're able to attach our experiences with them and the memories that generates to them. And now we have names to attach to these events. And yet, the naming of someone or even something, remember, God gave human beings the privilege of naming the rest of creation and the responsibility of naming the rest of creation. And so there's something that is special about the ability to name and to be named. And yet in the midst of that happening in this, we have the disconnection. God makes them close, but that wasn't God's plan. It wasn't God's plan for them to be covered, but they felt shame. And so God addresses their needs. In the midst of all of this, we hear this being, they're driven out of the garden. They have to leave this idyllic place that they've enjoyed. And yet in the midst of that disconnection, God still takes mercy upon them and addresses the need that they have, even though it's not God's plan. God adapts God's strategy. dare I say, tactics, means of doing things, even though God's intentions and purposes remain unchanged. So driving these human beings out and even placing guards with flaming swords to guard the way to the tree of life. But think about, what does that station mean? What is that guarding? What does the tree of life represent? The tree of life and this whole encounter that we've journeyed through in chapter 3 of Genesis. It's the tree of life represents, because remember, it's named the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The tree of life represents, now in particular, a choice to receive the truth and live in the truth of God versus the ways of the enemy. And so again, this is a matter of protection. And even though there is a new level of disconnection that is going to happen because the relationship has changed irrevocably, right? Even with restoration is just that. It is to restore something that was lost, but it's not the same as replacement. They can't go back. They can't go, and God, it's not God's intention here to go back and start over. We can deal with Noah another time. That's not God's intention, to start completely over. But it is there are little ways of restoration that allow us to start over and start anew and start fresh in small ways, to pivot and to turn and to adapt, even if it still moves us towards God's purposes and plans. And sometimes in our lives, we see ourselves going down a path and we think this is the path that God has chosen for us. And then something happens that derails that plan, and maybe we mess up, and maybe we make a mistake, and maybe it's someone else coming in and sabotaging that or harming our situation. And we have to pivot, and we have to go a different direction. We have to reroute ourselves, like GPS, when you make that turn and it starts to tell you rerouting as it figures out the new direction to take. That doesn't mean we don't get to the destination. It may mean it will take a little bit longer. It may mean that road won't be as smooth. It may mean that we will have other stops along the way, but it doesn't mean that the destination has been destroyed or that we have been destroyed in the process. We may even find ourselves discovering new paths and new ways of being. Even in disconnecting, God will be able to bring a blessing, and we'll be able to redirect and repurpose us and redirect and renew God's purposes in us in a fresh way. Don't let temporary circumstances make us distrust the purposes or the truth or the will and way of God. Because even when God is saying, okay, the garden didn't work, God doesn't give up on God's creation. Thank you for joining me again. I pray that if you have thoughts, that you will share them with me, or questions or your own reflections on this text. I'd love to hear them. Like and subscribe to this channel if you'd like to see more content along these lines. Planning another series for November, and that series will take us, and I'm just going to remind myself of that series for November of 2021. But of course, the wonderful thing about these YouTube videos is that they stay with us and that they last. And so the November series is inevitable. I can't wait to share and explore that with you. Until then, love God, love your neighbor, love yourself, unmasked, naked and unashamed. Be blessed, and I'll see you next time.